Warning: some details that follow may be disturbing. For decades, the disappearance of the entire crew of the fishing trawler the Siren's Call in the unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic in 1972 remained a nautical ghost story, a somber tale whispered among fishermen and port workers. Everyone, from coastal towns to national investigators, simply assumed the ship had been lost to the cruel caprice of a rogue wave or an unseen storm. A tragic accident swallowed whole by the sea's vast indifference. She just vanished, they'd say, gone without a trace. This remained the undisputed truth for 50 years, a cold case accepted as closed by nature, until a battered survival suit washed ashore on a remote Scottish island, carrying not just the salt of the ocean, but a horrifying, impossible secret within its lining. Evidence that proves this wasn't an accident. It was something far, far worse. If you believe some mysteries are meant to be uncovered, like and share this story. The air in the bustling port of Gloucester in the spring of 1972 vibrated with a familiar mix of hopeful energy and underlying tension. Salt spray mixed with the heavy scent of diesel and the cries of gulls scavenging near the docks. The air was thick with anticipation, a knot tightening in the stomachs of wives, children, and sweethearts gathered by the gangplank. There, sturdy and weathered, sat the Siren's Call, her nets piled high, her engines humming with barely contained power. For Captain Elias Thorne, a man whose face was etched with the lines of countless storms, this trip was routine, another paycheck earned the hard way. But for young Tom Avery, barely 20, it was his first major voyage, a chance to prove himself and send money home to his young wife Clara, who stood clutching their infant daughter, her eyes wide and glistening. First mate Ben Carter, ambitious and restless, scanned the horizon, impatient for the open sea and the promise of a good catch. Farewells were brief, charged with unspoken fears and fierce love. Clara pressed a worn cross into Tom's hand, her voice a choked whisper promising to be waiting. He gripped it tight, its rough wood a small anchor against the churning in his gut. He watched her face, trying to memorize every detail as the distance between them grew. The sounds of the port fading slightly as the ship's own rumble intensified. The ship's horn gave a deep, mournful blast, a sound that cut through the noise and settled heavy in everyone's chest. The final ropes were cast off, the gap widening, separating the solid land from the unpredictable blue. Tom leaned against the rail, the cold metal a stark reality beneath his palm, watching the figures on the dock shrink, their vibrant colors becoming mere specks against the gray backdrop of the shore. He felt the powerful thrum of the engines beneath his feet, the steady forward motion carrying him towards the vast, indifferent expanse of the North Atlantic. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cool spring air traced its way up his spine as the last glimpse of land faded, replaced by the endless horizon where the sky met the sea in a line that promised both bounty and terrifying anonymity. He turned, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the crew, each man turning away from the life they left behind, their hopes set on the waves ahead, unaware of the true depths they were sailing into. The mournful blast of the ship's horn echoed across the dock, a final drawn-out cry swallowed by the wind whipping off the water. Below, the thick ropes fell away, slapping wetly against the hull as the gap between the vessel and the land widened. From the deck, the familiar shapes of the harbor buildings and the waving figures on the shore blurred into an indistinct, receding line. There was a collective breath held by the crew leaning over the rail, a mix of exhilaration and profound trepidation. The land shrank, becoming a fragile thread on the horizon, then vanished entirely. It felt sudden, brutal, like a severance. On deck, the rhythm began almost immediately. The creak of wood, the slap of waves against the bow, the low thrum of the engine settling into its tireless beat. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting light and the changing watches. The ocean was a character unto itself, vast, indifferent, swallowing sound and distance with equal ease. Gulls, persistent companions at first, abandoned them somewhere beyond the continental shelf, weaving only the endless blue expanse above and below. A sense of routine, a fragile camaraderie, began to form among the men. Shared meals in the galley were punctuated by strained jokes and quiet questions about home. But beneath the surface, anxieties stirred. The engine, while running, seemed to have a new metallic rattle that hadn't been there before, a subtle cough in its steady pulse. And the captain, usually a man of quiet confidence, spent an unusual amount of time staring at the horizon, his brow furrowed. Even when the skies were clear, the strange, hazy green seemed to linger on the edges of the distant clouds, a color none of the veteran sailors could quite place. A silent, growing tension that settled like a fine mist over the ship. The endless, unchanging blue felt less like freedom and more like an enclosure, pushing them inexorably towards whatever lay hidden within the deep, unsettling currents ahead. The wind, a mournful sigh moments before, now shrieked through the rigging, a predatory sound that clawed at the very air. Black clouds, bruised purple and gray, descended with terrifying speed, swallowing the last sliver of light. Rain began not in drops, but in solid sheets, stinging the faces of the crew scrambling across the deck. Captain Elias felt the shift in the ship's motion, a sickening lurch that was more than just the waves. Below, the groaning and shuddering intensified, sounds usually muffled by distance, now echoing with alarming clarity. He barked orders into the gale, his voice raw, his eyes scanning the deck, the waves, the darkening sky, searching for a weak point, a reason for this sudden violent turn beyond the weather's fury. A surge of water crashed over the bow, cold and brutal, sweeping loose gear and knocking a sailor off his feet. Elias saw the fear bloom on faces around him, mirroring the knot tightening in his own gut. This wasn't just a storm. It felt like the ocean itself was actively tearing at them. Then came the sound that stole their breath, a deep, rending tear from somewhere below the waterline. A violent metallic scream swallowed almost instantly by the roar of the wind and waves, but undeniable. Panic flared. The ship listed sharply, a sickening tilt that sent unsecured items tumbling and threw men against bulkheads. Elias saw the deckhands struggling with the emergency pumps, their faces grim, the water rising around their boots at an impossible rate. He remembered standing on this very deck just days ago, watching dolphins leap in the calm sea, feeling the simple peace of a voyage underway. That memory felt impossibly distant now, a fragile dream shattered by the horrifying reality of the water now surging into the ship, not just over it. This wasn't just damage from the storm. This felt deliberate, catastrophic. A single sharp thought cut through the chaos. This shouldn't be happening. His mind flashed to the recent hurried repairs, the skipped checks, the unsettling pressure from shadowy figures before they sailed. As the ship continued its desperate, losing battle against the encroaching sea, Elias knew this wasn't an act of nature alone. Something far colder and crueler was at play beneath the waves. The great ship, once a symbol of strength and journey, was no more than a dying beast now. The deck pitched sharply, a sickening lurch that sent men sprawling across splintering wood. Below, the roar of the invading sea was deafening, a hungry growl that vibrated through the very soles of their boots. Metal shrieked in agony as bulkheads buckled, Doors slammed shut, trapping those within, and the elegant fixtures groaned under the immense, unforgiving pressure. Water surged up companionways like an angry tide, swallowing everything in its path: chairs, tables, hopes, dreams. Each agonizing degree the ship listed felt like a betrayal by the solid world. On the tilting bridge, Captain Jensen gripped the railing, his knuckles white. He saw faces of terror and grim resignation around him. His thoughts weren't of the ship anymore, but of his small cottage by the sea, the scent of salt spray on the porch, his wife's gentle hand. He closed his eyes for a brief second, a silent farewell carried on the howling wind. Nearby, a young sailor, barely 18, fumbled for a worn photograph tucked inside his jacket, his lips moving in a silent prayer to a mother far away. Others fought desperately, scrambling for anything buoyant, their eyes wide with a primal, desperate urge to cling to existence. The air was thick with the smell of oil, salt, and fear. A sudden, more violent lurch ripped through the vessel. The mainmast cracked with the sound of thunder, splintering and toppling into the maelstrom. The ship groaned, a deep, final exhalation as the stern rose impossibly high against the dark sky, revealing the turning propellers for a final haunting moment. Men tumbled into the churning water, their cries lost instantly to the roar of the sea. The ocean, vast and utterly indifferent, seemed to open up, a dark mouth swallowing the wreck whole. There was a final, tremendous gurgle, a sound of immense weight succumbing, and then silence. Nothing remained but the waves, washing over the spot where the ship had been, already erasing the memory of its passing. The cold embrace tightened around those who had been plunged into the abyss. The churning subsided, leaving only a vast, unsettled quiet where the mighty vessel had clawed at the surface moments before. Splintered planks, like forgotten bones, drifted lazily across the disturbed water. A child's small wooden doll, miraculously intact, bobbed gently near a broken chair leg, mute witnesses to a violence the ocean now sought to swallow whole. The air, thick with the metallic tang of fuel and the sharp sting of salt, held no sound save the soft, indifferent lapping of waves against the scattered debris. Gulls cried overhead, their calls distant and uncaring, echoing in the sudden, profound emptiness. It was a silence that screamed of absence, a void where laughter, shouts, and the thrum of engines had so recently vibrated with life. The ship was gone, swallowed by the deep, taking with it the vibrant pulse that had momentarily defied the sea's ancient dominion. There was no struggle visible on the surface, no desperate hands reaching for the sky, only the passive drift of wreckage under an indifferent sun. The sea, vast and eternal, had claimed its price, erasing the footprint of man with an almost casual power. It was a final, brutal statement of dominion, leaving nothing but the stark, desolate beauty of the waves and the ghost of what had been. This terrible stillness hung heavy in the air, a palpable weight felt not just here on the indifferent waters, but miles away, on distant shores, where waiting ears still strained for news that refused to come, shrouded in a growing fog of uncertainty and dread. The wind, usually a familiar companion carrying the tang of salt and fish guts, seemed to hold its breath over the small port town. Days bled into a week with only silence answering the hopeful glances out to the horizon. Wives clutched worn rosaries, mothers kept pots simmering on stoves long past mealtimes, and children, sensing the brittle tension, played quieter games on the docks where their fathers' boats should have been tied. Each delayed radio call, each skipped transmission, chipped away at the carefully constructed walls of hope. leaving a cold, hollow ache in their chests. Sarah, hands plunged into dishwater that had gone tepid hours ago, stared out at the empty berth where the Orion belonged, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She replayed Daniel's last words, "Be back soon, love, maybe with a bit of luck this time." Clinging to the normalcy of them, yet a chill snaked down her spine at the memory of his too-quick kiss goodbye. Then the news arrived not like a storm front, but a sudden, brutal wave. It started as a ripple, a hushed conversation overheard at the fish market, a breathless whisper about trouble, a cryptic signal picked up by another vessel further out. Something had happened. The air crackled with fearful speculation. People gathered in nervous clumps, faces pale, eyes wide and searching for confirmation they desperately didn't want to find. The sound of misses. Gable's keening wail cut through the rising murmur from her small cottage window overlooking the harbor. A raw, animal sound that tore through the town's fragile composure. Moments later, a figure, grim-faced and stooped, walked slowly from the harbor master's office towards the cluster of waiting families. The official confirmation a heavy burden on his shoulders. The silence that fell as he approached was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic slap of waves against the pier. His words, when they came, were few, formal, devastating. "Lost," he said, the single word hanging in the air like a death knell. All hands believed lost. The world tilted. Disbelief warred with a sudden, visceral comprehension. A woman screamed, a sharp, piercing sound swallowed by the rising tide of communal grief. Bodies crumpled, hands flew to mouths, tears streamed unchecked down weather-beaten faces. Sarah felt the dishcloth slip from her numb fingers, splashing back into the cold water. Her legs gave way, and she sank to the worn kitchen floor, the simple pattern of the linoleum blurring as her vision flooded. The silence in her small home was now deafening, amplifying the echoes of the sounds outside, the wails, the cries, the raw, open wounds of grief erupting across the town. The empty sea beyond her window seemed to stretch into an infinite, terrifying void. How could the sea, their provider, their lifeblood, have become a watery grave? The question hung unanswered, heavy with the terrible certainty that nothing would ever be the same. A cold dread settled in her bones, a premonition that this was only the beginning of their reckoning with the deep. The days blurred into a cycle of watching the horizon and waiting for news. The initial flurry of activity dwindled quickly. The vast, indifferent ocean swallowing the few boats that went out, their patrols feeling increasingly perfunctory, little more than obligated gestures. Official faces, tight with practiced sympathy, spoke of grid patterns and sonar sweeps. But Sarah saw the reports. Large areas unchecked, limited hours spent. A distinct lack of conviction in their efforts. Hope, once a fierce, flickering flame, began to gutter under the weight of the silence, broken only by the mournful cry of gulls and the relentless, empty sigh of the waves against the shore. She remembered the warmth of Daniel's hand the last time they walked here, the easy rhythm of his laughter echoing in her mind, a cruel counterpoint to the dread coiling in her stomach. Then came the meeting, held in a sterile room smelling faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. An official, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, delivered the pronouncement. After extensive search efforts, we have concluded there are no further viable avenues for rescue. The vessel and those aboard are declared lost at sea. The words hung in the air like lead weights, crushing the last embers of possibility. Sarah felt a physical shock, a cold wave washing over her, stealing her breath. Lost at sea. Not missing, not potentially adrift. Lost. The finality was absolute. A door slammed shut with brutal force. It wasn't just the end of hope for rescue. It was the beginning of a different, sharper pain. The grief of a loss without a body, without closure. A gaping wound that the simple phrase, "lost at sea," could never heal. A hot, burning injustice surged within her. How could they just stop? How could they use such a clinical term to dismiss entire lives? Where was the explanation? Where was the truth? The silence that followed the official statement wasn't just empty. It was filled with unanswered questions, with the deafening roar of the sea outside. A sea that now felt less like a natural force and more like an accomplice holding dark secrets. This couldn't be the end. It couldn't. 50 years blurred into a quiet ache. Sarah sat on the worn porch swing, the wood groaning a familiar tune under her weight, her fingers tracing the faint lines etched by time on her own skin. It felt impossible that half a century had passed since the world stopped. The vibrant green lawn before her was the same, yet different, its edges softening, the ancient oak in the corner thicker, casting a wider, deeper shadow. She remembered planting a sapling there, the spring before everything changed. A lifetime had unfolded, a lifetime marked by absence. There were graduations she only saw through the blurry lens of someone else's camera. Weddings where an empty seat felt like a gaping chasm. Holidays filled with forced smiles and a constant low hum of sorrow beneath the festive noise. Was it supposed to be this quiet? She'd often thought, even in the midst of life's busiest moments. The memories of that day were fragmented, sharp shards of light and sound, the smell of damp earth, the distant sound of a train whistle, a specific shade of faded blue jeans. These fragments would surface unexpectedly, triggered by the scent of rain or the chime of wind outside, sending a cold shiver down her spine. She had tried to move forward, built a life, found moments of fragile happiness, yet a heavy, invisible tether always pulled her back to the last time she saw them, young and full of dreams. Resignation had settled years ago, a heavy blanket over the burning need for answers. But beneath it, a tiny ember of why still glowed fiercely. She watched a robin hop across the grass, a simple act of life continuing, and felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it stole her breath. A visceral echo of the life taken, the future stolen. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back, the wood cool against her hair. Maybe, just maybe, the passage of time had hidden things too. Things that were now waiting to be found. The old photo album lay inside on the hall table, gathering dust. The official explanation, delivered with a chilling formality in a sterile conference room, spoke of an unavoidable tragedy, a perfect storm of extreme weather and unforeseen structural failure. They called it an act of God, a cruel twist of fate no one could have prevented. But sitting there, clutching a damp tissue, Sarah felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over her. An act of God? It sounded too clean, too easy. Across the room, Mr. Henderson's face mirrored her own skepticism, his eyes hard with suspicion as the official droned on about high winds and rogue waves. Sarah remembered the captain's confident reports, the ship's sturdy build. The stories felt like carefully constructed lies designed to soothe, or perhaps to bury. Something felt deeply wrong, a dissonance between the placid explanation and the violent reality they had witnessed. The air in the room felt thick with unspoken truths, heavy with the knowledge that corners had been cut, warnings ignored, lives deemed less valuable than profit margins. They didn't accept it. None of the families did. Fueled by grief and a gnawing sense of injustice, they began their own relentless quest. Sarah spent countless hours hunched over stacks of documents, navigating bureaucratic mazes that seemed intentionally designed to confuse and deter. Phone calls went unanswered, letters disappeared into administrative black holes, and meetings with officials felt like hitting a wall of polite, impenetrable indifference. She saw Mr. Davies, a quiet fisherman whose son was lost, grow thin with worry. His hands, usually steady with nets, now trembling as he sorted through faded reports. There were whispers among them of faulty equipment, ignored safety protocols, even pressure from higher-ups to maintain schedules regardless of risk. Every dead end, every slammed door, only strengthened their resolve and deepened their suspicion that negligence, or worse, deliberate malfeasance, had been swept under the rug, deemed less inconvenient than a public scandal. The years wore on, marked by small victories, a sympathetic ear here, a leaked document there, interspersed with crushing setbacks that tested their spirit. But the image of their loved ones, swallowed by the indifferent sea, under questionable circumstances, fueled an unyielding desire for accountability. They weren't just seeking closure. They were demanding justice for a truth deliberately obscured, a truth that felt just within reach, hidden somewhere behind the veil of official silence. The stack of unanswered queries on Sarah's desk grew higher, each paper a silent testament to their struggle, a faint, persistent knocking against a locked door. Years spun by, softening edges, blurring memories, turning tragedy into hushed legend, until 2022 arrived, bringing with it eyes capable of piercing the very floor of the world's oceans. In a quiet office filled with the soft hum of servers, Dr. Eris Thorne hunched over a bank of monitors, a solitary figure adrift in a sea of data. His mission felt vast, almost absurdly ambitious: systematically scan decades of accumulated bathymetric surveys, sonar pings, and satellite altimetry that comprise the digital skeleton of the global seafloor. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Perhaps patterns in sediment shifts, anomalies in volcanic ridges, anything that might shed light on the geological history of a specific deep trench. But in the back of his mind, a fainter, less scientific hope flickered. The persistent, if irrational notion that somewhere in this silent digital deep, a forgotten echo might remain. The technology was staggering, millions of square miles mapped with precision unimaginable to previous generations, rendering the ocean floor with the fidelity of a moonscape, thanks to everything from deep-sea submersibles to orbiting satellites beaming signals back to Earth. Eris scrolled, zoomed, and panned through endless fields of textured gray and blue, his fingers growing stiff, his eyes dry and aching. The monotony was profound, a digital meditation, broken only by the occasional ping of a processed grid or the subtle shift in color denoting a change in depth. Hours bled into days, days into weeks, a relentless, tedious march across submerged mountains and vast, empty plains. He thought of the sheer scale, the volume of raw information flowing through the cables, the sheer improbability of finding anything significant by pure, undirected searching. It felt like trying to pluck a single grain of sand from every beach on Earth simultaneously. He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes, his gaze drifting across a particularly flat expanse of abyssal plain, far from any known geological feature of interest. His cursor, a tiny white arrow against the deep blue, hovered aimlessly for a second before he prepared to scroll further. Then, something snagged his attention, a small, almost imperceptible disruption in the smooth gradient, A shape that didn't look quite right. Too angular. Too deliberate. Caught in the ghostly light of the sonar data. His breath hitched, the low hum of the office fading as his focus narrowed entirely on the screen. His hand trembled slightly as he zoomed in, the pixelated details resolving into something that stole the air from his lungs and sent a cold jolt down his spine. It wasn't a rock formation. It wasn't a natural curve of the seabed. And it looked eerily like something that couldn't, possibly be there. The familiar hum of the sonar equipment filled the small cabin, a steady drone that usually lulled him into a state of focused calm. Hours blurred into one long, meticulous scan of the dark, silent depths. He sat hunched before the primary display, eyes scanning the endless, undulating contours of the seafloor topography scrolling across the screen. It was a routine born of patience and perseverance, mapping the forgotten peaks and valleys far below. Then, amidst the expected geological noise, a faint disruption appeared. Not a peak, not a valley, but a strange, almost imperceptible abnormality in the data return. It registered first as just a slightly sharper line than the organic curves around it, a peculiar feature that snagged his attention. Curiosity, a familiar spark, flared in his chest. He leaned closer, his fingers flying across the keyboard, isolating the area, adjusting the contrast and resolution. The faint outline sharpened, revealing a shape that defied the natural chaos of the ocean floor. It was too regular, too deliberate. Disbelief washed over him like a cold wave. His breath caught in his throat. "What is this?" he thought. The question a silent shout in the quiet cabin. He zoomed in further, the pixels resolving into unnerving clarity. The shape wasn't just regular. It had straight edges, impossibly precise angles, a defined structure utterly alien to the surrounding sediment and rock. A growing sense of awe, mingled with a prickle of apprehension, crawled up his spine. This wasn't geology. His hands trembled slightly as he manipulated the image, his reflection staring back at him from the glass, eyes wide, jaw slack. The sheer scale began to dawn on him as the screen displayed the coordinates. It was enormous, lying there undisturbed for perhaps millennia. It felt impossible, a hallucination conjured by exhaustion. Yet the data was clean, sharp, undeniable. The anomaly wasn't a trick of the light or a glitch. It was there, a silent, massive secret embedded in the deep. It was not a wreck he was seeing, not a geological formation. The visual details hinted at something ancient, something constructed, something waiting. This finding changed everything he thought he knew about the ocean floor, and the isolation of the cabin suddenly felt profound as he wondered who else needed to see this. The anomaly shimmered on the sonar screen, a ghostly shape refusing to be dismissed. Hours blurred into a single, focused pursuit. Back in the cramped study, lit only by the cold glow of the monitors and a desk lamp, the discoverer hunched over charts and databases. They cross-referenced the precise coordinates captured by the sonar with maritime loss records, fingers flying across the keyboard, heart hammering against their ribs. Was it just rock? A geological feature? A forgotten fishing boat? Doubt gnawed, a constant, dull ache in their gut. They pulled dusty books from shelves, historical accounts of the treacherous waters, lists of vessels lost to storms or ice. Pages rustled, brittle and yellowed with age, filled with names and dates that were mere statistics until now. They consulted online archives, comparing the size and shape estimated by the sonar with known ship types from the era. The air grew heavy with anticipation, thick with the scent of old paper and stale coffee. With each matched detail, the length, the beam, The approximate period of sinking, based on sediment patterns and structural integrity estimates, the impossible began to solidify. A specific date appeared on a manifest of losses, linked to a vessel that vanished without a trace nearby. Then, cross-referencing that name with casualty lists, faces began to emerge from the historical record. Families left waiting, hopes eventually fading into the long, cold grip of time. The moment the last detail clicked into place, undeniable confirmation staring back from the screen was like a physical blow. The world tilted. This wasn't a rock. It wasn't just debris. It was it. The lost ship. The weight of decades of mystery, of unanswered questions, crashed down with overwhelming force. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in their eyes, blurring the names on the casualty list. A profound sorrow washed over them, a strange, intimate grief for strangers lost generations ago. Trembling hands reached for the phone, fingers hovering over the keypad. Who deserved to know first? The authorities? The surviving families, scattered and perhaps unaware that hope, however painful, had just returned. The silence in the room stretched, immense and heavy with the gravity of the discovery. The decision needed to be made. The secret that had lain hidden beneath the waves for so long was now theirs to share. The phones began to ring in scattered homes, bringing a silence heavier than any storm. A tremor went through the room as Sarah's mother dropped the receiver, her face ashen, a small cry escaping her lips before she crumpled into a chair, hands clasped over her mouth. Across town, Mr. Henderson stood frozen by his mailbox, the newspaper falling to the damp grass as a voice on the other end of the line spoke words he had waited decades to hear, yet dreaded with every beat of his heart. For so long, they had lived with the phantom weight of the missing vessel, the sea a vast, indifferent tomb. Now news of its discovery tore open the old wounds, flooding them with a chaotic tide of emotions. Grief washed over them anew, sharp and visceral, for the finality it brought, yet a flicker of desperate hope ignited. Hope for answers, for closure, for the truth that had eluded them. Fear, too, coiled in their stomachs, whispering dark possibilities about what the deep might reveal. The air crackled with unspoken prayers and ragged breaths as families absorbed the impossible reality. The ship had been found. Then came the images, grainy and otherworldly, shared grudgingly at first, then spreading like wildfire. They were views from the abyss, pieced together from remote analysis and the cold digital eye of technologies like Google Earth, showing the vessel lying broken on the seafloor. It hadn't simply settled, it lay twisted. Its hull ruptured near the bow, sections of its upper deck gone, the stern listing at an unnatural angle. The visual clues were stark and undeniable. Massive impact points suggested a collision far more violent than merely running aground in a storm. The structural failure wasn't uniform but concentrated, as if struck by an immense, concentrated force, or perhaps weakened deliberately before the final blow. The wreck's silent testimony spoke not of a tragic accident born solely of nature's fury, but of something far more deliberate, far more sinister, lying in wait. The mangled metal and splintered wood were evidence, immutable and stark, hinting that the vessel hadn't merely succumbed to the waves, but had been attacked, crippled, perhaps even sacrificed, setting the stage for the horrifying truth that the seabed had finally decided to unveil. For years, the cold silence had been their tormentor, a vast, empty space where answers should have been. They carried the weight of an impossible loss, A burden of whispers and unanswered questions that settled like dust on old photo albums. The authorities had closed the book. The town had moved on, but the families hadn't. Not really. They just learned to live with the dull ache of stagnation. Then the news broke, shattering the fragile peace they'd built around their grief. A wreck found beneath the dark water, a cruel, undeniable shape on the lakebed floor. It was a jolt, painful in its clarity, but beneath the shock bloomed something fierce and unexpected: hope. Hope twisted into raw determination. They gathered, not in hushed, tearful support groups anymore, but with squared shoulders and hard eyes. The photographs flashed across screens. The bus, partially submerged, a metallic scar on the otherwise serene landscape. Proof that it happened, proof that something was down there. "They said it was an accident," cried Mrs. Davison, her voice cracking, gripping a framed picture of her daughter. "They closed the case. But this changes everything." Their voices rose, a chorus of renewed fury and grief. They descended upon the police station like a storm front, demanding the case be reopened, their voices echoing off the linoleum floors. They pointed to the wreck's condition, its location, subtle details that contradicted the easy assumptions made decades ago. Old reports were pulled, dusty files that hadn't seen daylight in years. They confronted the new chief, the successor to the man who had dismissed their pleas. His eyes shifted under their collective gaze, a flicker of discomfort undeniable. "He knows we have leverage now," thought Mr. Henderson, feeling a surge of vindication tempered by decades of bitter disappointment. The air in the small meeting room crackled with tension, the sound of rustling papers punctuated by sharp, insistent questions. There would be resistance, they knew, the inertia of bureaucracy, the discomfort of revisiting old failures, perhaps even the fear of what the depths held. But for the first time in a long time, they felt the ground beneath their feet was solid. The wreck wasn't just a grave. It was a declaration, a silent witness demanding to be heard, and they would be its voice, no matter what dark secrets it unearthed. The heavy oak doors swung inward, revealing the stark formality of the hearing room. Rows of polished wood, the elevated bench, the solemn faces of those tasked with delivering the verdict. They filed in, the families, a silent, unified front against the vast, echoing space that felt cold despite the summer light streaming through tall windows. For years, decades, their grief had been a private agony, a whispered question mark hanging over every holiday, every milestone missed. Now, finally, it was public. As they took their seats, the tension was a physical weight, pressing down on shoulders, tightening chests. Mrs. Chen clutched a faded photograph, her knuckles white. Beside her, Mr. Davies stared fixedly at the front, his jaw set, the tremor in his hands barely perceptible. The room fell silent as the presiding official began to read, their voice clear and measured, laying bare the negligence, the deliberate corners cut, the prioritization of profit over safety that had led to the unspeakable tragedy. Each word of finding was a hammer blow, shattering the long-held, painful uncertainty, replacing it with a hard, undeniable truth. A collective breath hitched as the official named names, assigned accountability. Tears streamed silently down faces, not tears of fresh sorrow, but of years of dammed-up pain finally finding an outlet. There was anger, yes, a hot surge of righteous fury for the callous disregard. But beneath it, something fragile began to form, a sense of profound vindication. It wasn't the return of their children, their loved ones, but it was the official acknowledgement that their lives had mattered, that their loss was a consequence of deliberate failure, not just cruel fate. A quiet sob escaped someone near the back. A man buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with silent emotion. This was justice, not a perfect healing balm, but a recognition, a burden of guilt finally placed where it belonged. After the reading concluded, after the low murmur of the room resumed, they remained seated for a long moment, the silence amplifying the buzzing in their ears, the rapid beat of their hearts. They looked at each other, across the rows, a shared look of exhaustion, of sorrow, but also of a fragile, hard-won peace. The chapter of seeking answers was closed, but the long, complex journey of living with the answer was just beginning. The quiet after the storm settled, a heavy blanket woven from exhaustion and truth. Accountability had been met, not with fanfare or relief, but with a profound, bone-deep weariness. For the families, the raw, tearing grief was now edged with a new understanding, a cold clarity that stripped away the haunting questions of how and replaced them with the searing pain of why. The main character felt it like a physical weight lifting from their shoulders, only to reveal a void beneath, different but no less aching. They saw it in the eyes of the others, the shared exhaustion, the faint lines of acceptance beginning to etch themselves around eyes still shadowed with sorrow. The truth, brutal as it was, allowed for a different kind of mourning. No longer were their loved ones just gone, lost to a mysterious, intangible fate. Now they were victims of a specific horrific act, their final moments tragically known. This knowledge didn't heal, but it provided ground to stand on. They began to gather, not just for answers anymore, but for solace in their shared, specific pain. In quiet rooms, the air thick with unspoken memories and the faint scent of stale coffee, they started the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. Finding peace wasn't an event, but 1,000 tiny moments. Sharing a forgotten anecdote that now held a new poignancy. Holding a fragile photograph and feeling love bloom instead of just sorrow. Or simply sitting in silence, needing no words. They found strength in honoring the lost with the full truth in hand. A memorial was built, simple and stark, inscribed not just with names, but with a quiet defiance against the darkness that had claimed them. Here, families left tokens: a worn baseball glove, a faded ribbon, a favorite book, each item a story finally told completely. The main character, standing before the wall of names one sun-drenched afternoon, felt a fragile emotion surface. It wasn't happiness, but a quiet sense of continuation, of carrying the flame rather than being consumed by the ash. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and the distant sound of children playing reached them, a reminder of life persisting. This shared struggle transformed their grief. It coalesced into a fierce, protective bond between the families, a silent understanding forged in shared loss and the long fight for truth. It became advocacy, a quiet determination to ensure no other family would endure such prolonged agony, such a twisting of hope. Their lives were forever marked, the innocence of the before irrevocably lost. But the after was not just sorrow. It was resilience, remembrance, and the quiet, powerful legacy of those they refused to let be forgotten. Yet, even in this period of painful peace, the journey felt incomplete. A story paused, but not finished, hinting at ripples spreading outwards. 50 years had passed since the waves first claimed the ship, a half-century marked by a void that echoed louder than any storm. Now, standing on the cliff edge, the salt spray a cool kiss on their faces. They looked out at the coordinates, a marker of the sea's embrace. It had been a journey etched in the enduring power of memory, passed down through generations, a story whispered at hearths and shouted in moments of raw grief. The faces of the lost, preserved in fading photographs, lived on in their hearts, a constant ache and a stubborn spark of hope. Decades dissolved into the mist of recollection, each year a tide pulling the mystery further out, yet the anchor of remembrance held firm. The discovery hadn't come from tireless searching of the surface, but from the unexpected depths plumbed by technology undreamed of when the ship went down. Sonar pings, autonomous vehicles descending into the crushing darkness, painted a picture the human eye could never have seen. A ghostly shape emerging from the seabed, confirming the impossible truth, bringing resolution in the most unforeseen way. Hope, a flickering candle in the long night, had somehow survived the relentless winds of time and despair. It lived in the refusal to forget, in the quiet determination of families who never stopped asking, never stopped believing that the sea held secrets that could one day be revealed. And now there it was, confirmed, the final resting place. The ship lay still, a silent sentinel on the ocean floor, holding its crew in an eternal slumber, cradled by the currents. The air felt heavy, thick, with the weight of 5 decades of waiting, of grieving, of questioning. The gentle lapping of waves below seemed to murmur the names of the lost, a soft, melancholic roll call. It was a peace hard won, saturated with sorrow, but peace nonetheless. The truth, brought forth from the cold, dark water, didn't erase the pain, but it provided a foundation for healing. It underscored the interconnectedness of past and present, showing how the threads of history, though submerged, could still be pulled to the surface, tying the living to the departed. The journey had been long, marked by setbacks and moments that threatened to extinguish all light, but the discovery, the confirmation, offered a sense of completion. It was a powerful, empathetic acknowledgement of their sacrifice, an inspiring testament to the fact that remembrance, fueled by perseverance and aided by ingenuity, could bridge the gap of time and loss, bringing a measure of justice and closure to a 50-year wound. Looking out at the vast expanse, the water, a shifting canvas of blue and gray, a quiet wariness settled over them. It wasn't the sharp, tearing agony of the early years, but a dull, persistent ache, a phantom limb where a part of their lives, of their history, should have been. Even with the truth revealed, the emptiness remained, a space the 50 years of absence had carved deep within. There was a distribution of emotions, a faint relief mingling with the lingering sadness, a quiet understanding tempered by the cold reality of what was lost. It was an ending, yes, but not a triumphant one, more like a quiet sigh escaping the collective chest. The sunlight, weak and watery through the thin clouds, struck the surface of the sea, scattering across the waves like countless tiny shards of light, each one a fragile, flickering hope against the immense, indifferent darkness below.